what makes this just really disturbing is not only did no one help him, but these young people pulled out their phones and start filming. And afterwards, some of them actually posted it to social media, which, is a different kind of sickness.
Right. And that's a practice today that we've watched many fights on social media. In the classroom, watching teachers get hit or whatever, and students.
Yeah.
And no one intervening, but recording.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome to the 28th episode of Love, Growth, and Narratives. I'm Tiffany.
And I'm Frederick.
And today we're going to be talking about the bystander effect.
Yeah, and when we talk about the bystander effect, in sociological terms, it talks about how the larger the crowd is to witness a tragedy, the less chance of anyone getting involved. But we wanted to talk about it on a grander scale, where we talk about just sometimes with the smaller things where we need to jump in and do something where we haven't. And so we'll talk about some famous cases out there, and we'll also talk about some everyday events where the bystander effect has a huge impact.
And this is going to be a 2-part series. So in this part, we're going to talk about some cases of where people are bystanders and shouldn't be. And then the next part, we'll talk about what we can do, to remedy some of that. Because we understand that not everyone's going to jump in physically, but not all bystander situations are dangerous. And we still end up being a bystander. So we'll have some discussion around that in part 2.
Yeah, and we'll learn that, what you can't do is nothing. And there's a huge spectrum between jumping into something where you're putting your body or the lives of your family in jeopardy to save someone, and just calling the police or whatever the case may be. There's a huge spectrum between the two, and we'll talk about that in the second episode.
Yeah, and I'd like people to think about, between this episode and the next one, some of us are natural at jumping in and helping out, and other people have to work at it a little bit. And usually there's a reason why we fall on one side or the other. So just thinking about where you are, where you could be, and maybe why you're in that space. I know that I'm a type of person to try to jump in and save everyone and everything. And I know why I'm that way, and I realize I can't do that all the time. However, I do feel like that is my position as a citizen in this world.
Yeah. So we'll get more into that. Is there any announcements we need to make before we get into the podcast?
Just continue to share and like and subscribe to our podcast on the variety of platforms that we're on. We are seeing that people are watching. We've got 400 plus views on a couple of our shorts, I think it was.
A lot of shorts.
Right? So that was awesome. A little bit of feedback here and there. Continue with the feedback. We appreciate it. We got some new feedback from people that we don't know, and that was interesting. So if you'd like to see what that is, go and sign on to YouTube and have a look. But yes, please continue to share, subscribe, all of that good stuff, and listen and give us feedback about the things that we're talking about or something that you'd like to hear about.
Good faith feedback, by the way.
Right.
Not we don't need to be called idiots or anything like that. So we appreciate good feedback.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the episode.
Yes.
All right.
So as we've talked about in the past, this podcast came about because we're always having discussions about different things, right?
Yeah.
And one discussion we had recently is about the celebrities that are in the news for sexual assault, right? And they've done it for a number of years, decades even. And we're talking about they would not have been able to do what they did to the extent of what they did without bystanders.
Yes.
And that's how we said, hey, let's have a conversation about that on the podcast. And that's how we got to this point where we're talking about bystanders, whether it be something like sexual assault or just not speaking up in a meeting.
Yes.
So let's talk more to that.
Yeah, and a lot of this came out in the news back in the 60s in the Kitty Genovese case, which a lot of people have heard about Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was a young woman who was walking home. If I remember correctly, she was walking home from work. It was around 2, 3 o'clock in the morning in the Kew Gardens section of Queens, New York. And she saw someone walking towards her from behind her, and she got scared and she started running and screaming. And the gentleman apparently caught up to her and was beating her and stabbing her and raping her. And she yelled and screamed. And as the story goes, a gentleman was looking out his window. This is a large apartment complex, well, of the apartment buildings. And the gentleman looked out and said, "Hey, leave her alone." And the perpetrator ran away and left Kitty Genovese, bleeding and in pretty bad shape. So then she starts walking towards her apartment, and he apparently comes back around and catches her in the vestibule. And at that point, he starts raping her and beating her again. And and she's yelling and screaming, of course, and you have neighbors and stuff like that. And there are a bunch of different reports to whether the neighbors got involved or whatever the case may be. And she died based on the second attack. So there wasn't just one attack, there was two attacks by the same gentleman, and she died based on the second attack, where the news came out and the New York Times and others were saying, well, there were all of these bystanders. In fact, I think in the New York Times it was saying 37 bystanders watched Kitty Genovese die, and that wasn't totally true, but there was a lot going on, and people who may have been able to get involved and stop the situation and didn't. And so this young lady lost her life. Now, one of the things that's come from that is not only, sociologists talking about the bystander effect, but what most people don't know was this is around the time when 911, and she is actually credited with why 911 started, because in this part of New York, there would be like call boxes, and pay phones and stuff like that. But there was a number that you were supposed to call for the police. And you would have to memorize that number. And depending on what neighborhood you were in or what state you were in, the number, of course, would be different. And so that's why this nationwide 911 came out. And I'm sure there were probably commercials. I wasn't around back in the 60s, so I would imagine there was a lot of commercials and a lot of publicizing, 911 services because of Kitty Genovese. But I also want to bring it more so towards today in the story of Cassine Morris. Cassine Morris was a high school senior in Long Island, New York, and there was, and the stories are different. There apparently there was a situation that had to do with a young lady and these two rival high schools.
And this is 2019.
I'm
right?
sorry. Yes, this is 2019. So this is fairly recent. And he was walking near this strip mall in Long Island that apparently a lot of the kids would go to after school. And the other high school that they were at war with apparently came over to fight them, and they said that there were 5 to 7 guys that were beating and stabbing Cassine Morris. And what makes this just really disturbing is not only did no one help him, but these young people pulled out their phones and start filming, and afterwards some of them actually posted it to social media, which is a different kind of sickness.
Right. And that's a practice today that we've watched many fights on social media in the classroom, watching teachers get hit or whatever, and students.
Yeah.
And no one intervening, but recording.
Yeah. And to me, that's even worse than not intervening, but sitting there recording it and then putting it out on social media. That really takes it to a new level. And so Cassine Morris, eventually died because of his injuries. And one gentleman was put on trial and convicted of stabbing him. And I don't recall, what the sentence was or anything. But the reason why I brought it up is you have to ask yourself, if people had intervened, there were reports that there were up to 50 people, watching, and you're looking at reportedly 5 to 7 high schoolers beating up on this gentleman.
Right.
What could have happened if, say, 15, of the bystanders said, "Hey, no, stop."
Right.
Or had jumped in and grabbed a few of them or something.
Right.
Something. Where, would Cassine Morris still be around? We don't know that, but we do know what happens when no one jumps in.
Right. And people listening might be thinking, it's dangerous, and we're not excusing the videotaping and the uploading of social media, but some people feel like it's dangerous. I don't want to get hurt. But there are ways to intervene without physically doing so. And then you also have to think about when there's dozens of people around, dozens of people jumping on some people, you probably are going to win, So if we thought in that mindset, well, we're going to work together to do this, which we know there's cases where people have done that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Like in 9/11 with the flight of the flight that was going towards the Pentagon, right?
Yeah.
And there's other cases, right? I mean, people do intervene, but
that was the flight. That was the flight that landed in Pennsylvania.
Yes. People do intervene, but probably not enough. And there's stories or instances that are much less violent where people still can intervene and they don't, when they know that something is not right.
Yes.
Not speaking up, not saying anything about it, actually joining in on the practice when it's not the best practice, whatever it is, and just not saying anything.
Yeah, and there's everyday cases that may not lead to violence, may not lead to death, but leads to the degradation of society. And I think about, when I was in the military and, in my teens and, late teens and early 20s, was that there were times when, being in a tactical unit of, mainly men, men and boys, because I don't know if you want to call 18-year-olds men, but males.
Yeah.
And how the catcalling and sometimes leading to actual harassment of female soldiers. And I have to confess, on too many occasions, I didn't jump in. I didn't participate, but I also didn't jump in and say, "Hey, man, that's not cool." And I have to be accountable for that, because here you had women who just want to come out and do a job, and they can't do that because you have someone messing with them. You have these, who call themselves men, and it's not right. And I know that those were times when I should have jumped in and did not. Do you have any situations like that when you were young?
I have things that happened to me.
Yeah.
When I can think about growing up, we didn't have a car. So I rode the RTD, dating myself here, the RTD to junior high. And every day there was a man on the bus. The bus would be packed with, students as well as just people going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like standing room only. And there was a man on the bus who would grind up against different, girls and women. And you could move away from him, but he scooted up close to you. And this happened like every day. I think it was even at some point on the news or something like that. But everyone knew what he was doing. Everyone would just kind of move themselves. I mean, he was doing it to women, but they would just try to move themselves away. But there was only so much you can move because the bus was completely packed. But nobody stopped this person from doing it. None of us screamed out. I mean, I was a kid. I still could have, but I was scared.
Yeah.
Right. And you see him doing this to other women, and the women aren't necessarily saying anything. They're trying to move away from the person, but everyone can see it. Everyone's looking at him, moving himself closer to anyone who moved away from him, and no one said anything or did anything. And another big instance is like growing up, my mom's ex-husband was violent in the home, and I would run through the building and like bang on doors and ask somebody to call the police, like to help. No one even like answered. No one said anything through the door. Nobody called the police.
Yeah.
And I was afraid to call the police myself back then, because a lot of the times the police officers would say who called, which would just make him more enraged.
Yeah.
But I got to a point where I did call, and I would say, hey, don't say that I'm calling, and sometimes they did anyway. What are you going to do? You have to call. But the fact that no one helped, no one in the building even, it's one thing not to open your door, but not to call the police, not to open the door and let the kid come in at least, right. Or, I had friends whose friends and their parents knew what we were going through, and no support there either. So I understand everyone's kind of scared and doesn't want to get involved, but my goodness,
Yeah, and I think that there's another component to that, to be honest with you. A lot of people still feel like it's the police's job to come and save you. And what I've been saying for the longest time, and it's actually been shown in Supreme Court cases, is that you as a citizen of the United States do not have a constitutional right to police protection. You don't. And anyone who doesn't believe me, and I love when people don't believe me, please don't believe me, and research for yourself. Cases like Castle Rock v. Gonzalez, Warren v. District of Columbia, and another one is DeShaney v. Winnebago County. These are Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court said you do not have a constitutional right to police protection. And so that's got to sit with you. You really need to think about that when you're assuming that someone else is going to get involved. And some of these cases, especially I believe it was Castle Rock v. Gonzalez, had to do with children.
And let's be clear, when you say we don't have a constitutional right to protection, you're also saying the police officers do not have to.
No, they do not.
They do not have to save you.
They do not.
They are not required.
They are not legally required to save you.
And this is not a bash against police officers. No. We're just stating facts.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a 14th Amendment right to due process that a lot of police departments and towns and cities use as a way out of having to protect someone. And so it would be nice when they do protect you, but they're not always going to be there. And let's just say, for instance, that case or that situation didn't apply, that you did have a constitutional right for police protection. They can't be everywhere.
Right.
So again, just like you said, we're not bashing the police, but they can't be everywhere. And if you look at what happened in places like Uvalde, where the police were there, where they showed up and did nothing. And you had a poor mother who had to say, no, I'm going in to get my kids, you know, and I'm not saying that that's what everyone needs to do is jump in and take it in your own hands. However, you have to understand that no one is required to come save you.
Right.
Nobody. And so when you see things happening on the street and you just assume that the police are coming, they may be, but they may not be.
Right. Or there's a certain amount of time it takes for them to get there. I mean,
Yes.
they could get there in 5 minutes, but in 5 minutes, a lot can happen.
A whole lot can happen
Right.
in 5 minutes.
Right. So as you were saying earlier, we are our first responders.
Yes.
And then we as citizens and our
Yes.
fellow citizens, we need to step in. Although we are not required either.
Right.
There's so much more of us, right? And we're usually there first on the scene.
Yes.
So giving some type of support. Again, we're not always talking about crimes like this, right? There's so many different areas where people can speak up and they don't.
Yeah. I mean, there's another one where, and I've seen this on a few occasions where, driving down the highway, and you see someone swerving, constantly swerving. And I'm not talking about switching lanes and stuff. I'm talking about driving erratically where you're actually going in and out of the same lane, and it seems like someone may be driving under the influence. They may be drunk. How many people are willing to call the police?
Right.
And how many people are just going to say, well, my exit is coming up, whatever, not my problem. As a society, we need to take responsibility over more things and stop waiting for the politicians and the police department and everyone else to fix it but us. And I'm not trying to say that everyone has to jump in and, if someone's drunk driving, I'm not trying to say you should cut them off and, do a citizen's arrest. But what we're going to talk about in the next episode is the vast spectrum between putting your life on the line for someone else and some of the minor things that you can do, which don't put your life in jeopardy, where you can be of some service.
Right. Right. I know myself, I always call. I always intervene in some way, maybe not physically get out of my car or yell or anything like that, but I'm always calling the police when I see something, that shouldn't be, someone being hurt, basically.
Yeah.
Or, speaking up when something's not right. I mean, it could be even at work, just, whoa, this is not working. This is not helping kids. Let's do something different. Just being that one to speak up and not just go along with it. Good and well that it isn't best practices, but you do it because, there's a PD about it, but you know that it's not the best practice. And eventually somebody says that and the right person says it and then everyone listens, but you still need to speak up. You need to say something when you know that something isn't right. It's not always so big as like someone being physically violated.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder about that. What makes some people jump in, and whereas you have some people who are either afraid to jump in or some people who just don't care. And it's like, not my problem.
Right.
What about you? Is it something that, like the stuff that you had talked about before, where you would run up and down the hallway and no one would help? Are those the situations that kind of made you such a protector? Or do you think there's a chance that you just would have been that way anyway?
It may be just in me, but I can go further back than that situation, just being a kid and being picked on and like having no one to intervene.
Yeah.
So I try to let my students know right away. If someone's bothering you, let me know. I'm going to find who they are at school and we're going to have this conversation and we're going to deal with it, because I don't feel like that happened to me.
Yeah.
I just don't like to see, I don't, before I even knew the term bystander, I knew that I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
I don't like to see people struggling on their own. It may have something to do with me being an only child and I have to speak up for myself, or things that were going on at home. Like during that time period, my mom was married. Like you know, I had to speak up and step in, and probably more than I should have
Yeah.
needed to as a teen. But that did shape exactly like how I am now today, how I will speak up for people who don't speak up for themselves, or
Yeah.
I'm going to help out in some kind of way. I just think that's our job as humans to do that
Yes.
for each other. You don't have to be a family member, you know, for me to do that. I feel like that's our job as a fellow human.
Yeah, it is. And I think about the situations that happened in my life, and I've spoken about it on previous podcasts, how, you know, when we lived in New Jersey, as well as right outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Mount Lebanon, how there were times that I would get jumped on the playground and like no one is coming. And so, you know, when I was a teenager and even into my 20s, you know, I felt like I needed to protect a lot of my friends and family. Now, that sounds like a great thing, but I also wasn't a tough guy. So sometimes I probably took more beatings than I should have, you know, by trying to protect people around me. But I guess as I get older, you learn that there are still ways that you can help the situation without just throwing your body out there.
Right.
But I feel like doing nothing is unacceptable. You know, we have to find something, but absolutely nothing is unacceptable. And this thing that we're doing now in terms of let's just record it and share it on social media, we really have to stop. We really have to stop. And I know a lot of times in the beginning that recording was done as proof, you know, so you could give it to the police or, you know, whatever the case may be. But now we're doing it just so that we can just show off to people what we just saw. And I think there's just a level of sickness in that.
There's, and I think prior to the phone in your pocket phase, I think people may have intervened a little bit more in terms of, we were talking about this too, like elders would jump in if they saw the neighborhood kids doing something, or, you know, I would say elders really did speak up a lot more in the past. And
absolutely.
We as a society would be like, okay, oh, sorry, sir, ma'am, whatever. But now there's a lot of respect lost for elders and for young, you know, children even. Where it's just like, I don't care. I don't care who you are, how old you are. I don't care if you're my teacher, my parent. You know, it's gotten like the lack of respect has really gone left. And so maybe a lot of people feel like, well, I'm not going to say anything because they're going to turn on me. This has become, you know, get out of control. I think in those instances, if we all have the mindset that we are going to step in, if we see someone, if one person does step in and we see that person being violent or, you know, verbally abusive towards that person, that more of us jump in and stop it, right? Because that's what they're betting on. Right? That's what even the people who go into these places and shoot up, they're betting on that there's no one there who's going to stop them. No one's going to have a gun but me. And I'm going to be able to do the damage. And that's what a lot of people are betting on, that no one's going to help. No one's going to step in. I mean, the fact that the case you were talking about earlier, that this person would rape someone in a highly populated area at night and got away with it like he probably thought he could, that's awful. It's horrible.
And she's yelling and screaming for her life, and no one is doing anything. And, you know, like I said, there were mixed reports, because there were some people who came out later and said, yeah, I did call the police, but they had me on hold, or whatever the case may be. But in terms of the actual bystander effect, you see where the more people who witness something, the lesser chance that someone is going to get involved. Because, like, if you're the only witness in something, you realize that if you don't do anything, no one's going to do anything. But you get 30, 40 other people, and everyone is looking around waiting for someone to jump in. And, you know, maybe it takes a bit of bravery to maybe not just jump in or just say, hey guys, let's do something.
Right.
But we we have to be better. And I don't want to go too deep into this because that's what we're going to talk about in the second episode. But I think for me, one of the main things is just realizing that no one is coming to save you. And if we want society to get better, we have to stop putting everything on the police department to fix crime. Not to say that the police can't have an impact on crime, but police can't be everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of how many officers there are in your local area, and then think of how many people are in your local area, they can't be everywhere.
Right.
And so we have to do a better job. And I think that's one of the themes that we keep running into in so many of our episodes of the podcast is stop looking for someone else to do something when you can do something yourself.
Right. And so this applies to so many different things that we see going wrong in society, politically, on and on and on. It's not just, some crime being committed. I mean,
Yes.
those are crimes as well, if you ask me. But the fact that we think, well, I'm not going to vote, somebody else will vote, or somebody else will do it, or my vote won't matter, or I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to speak about it, somebody else will. That mindset that somebody else will, or that your voice isn't important and it's not going to make a difference, we have to get away from that. Because being a bystander can apply in many, many different areas.
Right. And we're gonna go year after year blaming the police department, blaming local officials for not fixing something that we have a level of responsibility in. We have to stop doing that.
We do.
Yeah. So I think that we've discussed this at length, and we want everyone to stay tuned for the second episode, because we want people to understand that there are things that you can do, whether you're willing to put your life out there or not. And I know the older you get, the more you have a family and things of that nature, the less apt you are to physically jump in, which is fine. I'm not asking everyone to physically jump in and save someone, but having a list of things that you're willing to do, I think is critical.
I agree. And again, not just talking about situations where there's violence, but speaking up when there's policies and practices
Yes.
and procedures that are not the best thing, to say something about that, to speak up about it. You might decide, well, I'm not going to follow that, but why not share that with other people? Share what your idea is with other people so that more people can get on board, because it's going to take a lot of us to band together in order to make some of the changes that we want to see in society. So being a bystander, again, is not just about not jumping into some violent thing that you've seen, but it's a lot of everyday situations that go on. So don't be a bystander.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there. That's what we do in our podcast, and we also do it in our lives, is putting ourselves out there. And you know that when you do that, you're putting yourself out there for criticism. If that's the worst that someone can do, that's fine.
Right. And while we're going to talk more about ways that we think, you could, not be a bystander, I'm not insinuating everyone should jump into every situation. We can't. We don't have the time. We don't have the mental, emotional capacity. And we do expect other people to sometimes do things,
yes.
right? It can't just always be one person.
Yes.
It's way too often. But we are saying that if you recognize that you're a bystander more often than not, that you challenge yourself not to be, right?
Yes.
And so I think we all need to do the work from time to time in order for things to be better. But you'll notice if you reflect back, there are certain people in your family, at your job, around you, that they're always the ones who are saying something. They're always the ones speaking up, and so maybe join them sometimes.
Yeah, see what happens.
Yeah.
You might surprise yourself in, seeing your own bravery. And one of the things that I found as someone who speaks out a lot is you'll also find people who are like-minded, but were afraid to speak up. And sometimes you can give them courage through your own courage.
Yeah.
So, so for Love, Growth, and Narratives, episode 28, I'm Freddie.
And I'm Tiffany.
And please tune in for the next episode where we'll talk about these prescriptions and go further into the conversation. And also, please, comment on our social media, on our YouTube. We love to read the comments, even the ones that disagree with us. I love that. I love having good faith discussions. And so, but I really appreciate your time, and you take care out there.
Thank you. See you next week.